Welcome everybody who is taking the time out of their day to tune in. I appreciate you guys taking some time. I think that this topic, while very divisive for the city of Hoboken, rent control, is a very important one to get educated on. As I kind of said in some advertising and marketing stuff behind this, I'm a huge proponent of getting educated on everything. It's the way that I built my real estate business and making sure that my clients are fully educated on the entire process. If they're an investor, rent control always comes up. It's something that I make sure that my clients are as educated as possible on. So I thought I looked at this vote and the people that are involved in it have been active, and there's been a lot of stuff back and forth on social media and a lot of information. Frankly, Ron, I was one of the people that got one of your flyers on my car. And it's kind of where it popped in my head. I went, okay, this is an opportunity here to educate as many people as we possibly can. So with that, guys, a couple of kind of ground rules here as we get started. Please understand that this is not, I'm not looking at this as an opportunity to sling money at anybody or to, drag anybody on this entire process. I truly don't care which way anybody decides to vote. That is your own business. And I meant in my recent Instagram post was I miss the days where political opinions were kept to themselves. And frankly, I'm just ready for this entire election to be done. But with that, I think it's important that everybody get as much education as they can about the topics they're going to be on. The big one in Hoboken, our local policy, is going to be the question built around the upcoming rent control changes. And who better to speak on those changes than those that are involved? So today we have Ron Simoncini here. And he is the kind of the head person behind the decontrol option. Ron, thank you so much for jumping on and taking some time.
Tom, I appreciate you having me. Thank you.
Yeah, man. So let's kind of dive right in here. There will be some live Q&A, guys. There's a chat box there, so feel free to drop questions in there. And as I can get to them, I will certainly bring them up on the screen, and we will try to address as much as we can. When we get started, Ron, can you give us a little bit of background about who you are and what makes you kind of the head guy and the professional behind this whole vote yes and remove the rent control standards as they currently are written in Hoboken?
Yeah. So my background is in real estate communications and property rights. Way back when, in the late 80s, I did a white paper on rent control in New Jersey for the League of Municipalities. It bridged the Rent Stabilization Officers Committee with the property owners from the New Jersey Apartment Association. And we started to have a very productive dialogue about rent control issues as a result of that. And since then, the property owners have sought my, help on some of these issues locally when we need some education on rent control or we need some advocacy about rent control. I've been fortunate enough to get a lot of that business.
Okay. So is your specialty then your firm's specialty in rent control and rent decontrol at this point?
I mean, our specialty is in property rights. Rent control is a subset of the property rights issues. We understand how transactions are made. I think we understand how development occurs. And, we're just a communications firm. There are tons of professionals, legal professionals, brokerage professionals, developers, engineers that sort of are in the soup of this business. But I think that we've become, sort of a go-to firm on policy issues.
Okay.
Now, that doesn't mean that like everybody complains, geez, they do this for money. Well, yeah, I do have to make a living at this. And I spent a lot of time developing the sorts of resources that are needed to do these campaigns. And it costs money to do that. But that doesn't mean that I don't firmly hold these convictions. I never make an argument from a policy point of view that I don't believe in. And that's because it's 565 towns, but it's a small state. It's a 40-year career in this. If I go in the bag for somebody, everyone knows it. And then the next person that I go to, I don't have any credibility. So these are my firmly held beliefs. I often have to confront differences between what real estate owners and developers would like to have happen against what I think is reasonable to pursue. And I try to be honest about that.
Okay. Now, to kind of give a broad paint with a broad brush here, give everybody a kind of an overview as to what the rent control rules as they currently stand in Hoboken. What are they currently, and let's dive into a little bit about what this vote means coming up on Tuesday.
So the ordinance has multiple provisions, but the two central provisions in the ordinance are the annual increase, which is set at consumer price index not to exceed 5%, and the decontrol upon vacancy, which currently you can get no more than 25% increase in rent on a decontrol, and you can get that no more often than every 3 years. So if you have a tenant who's there 10 years, you get one decontrol. If the next tenant stays 10 years, you get one decontrol. If the next tenant stays 1 year, you don't get that second decontrol because you haven't had 3 years between the most recent decontrol and that tenant vacating the apartment. And what happens there?
Now, Ron, quick question while I'm thinking about it. The decontrol, the 25%, that does not apply during the life of the lease either. That's
No.
at the end of that lease, at the end of that tenant leaving, you get that 25% added on.
Yes, and rent control is sensible social legislation from one point of view. When there's a constriction of supply, the landlord has an unfair advantage in the bargain. There's no question about that. Mm-hmm. So when you enact rent control, what you do is you say, if you can afford the apartment when you move in, we'll make sure it's affordable to you through the life of your tenancy, however long that is. Mm-hmm. So the rent control increases are set by the council, and at 3%, 3.5%, whatever they'll be this year, rents will increase at a lesser rate than taxes and at a lesser rate than wages. Now, not every tenant is going to get a 5% raise this year, but generally speaking in the economy, wages will increase at a faster rate than rent control will this year.
Okay. So let's talk a little bit about more. I kind of cut you off there. Continue on with the way that rent control is currently written in Hoboken, because as somebody that's trying to change it, I think it's good to kind of understand where we're starting from right now as it stands. Because the truth is, I deal with a lot of clients who don't even understand the inner workings of rent control as it stands now, let alone what it's going to look like if and when it changes.
Yeah. So it changes a lot. A couple provisions that are important to understand related to vacancy decontrol. And you know this from being in the business, Tom. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Apartments that turn over tend to turn over, and apartments that don't turn over tend to not turn over. Yep. So when you have a tenant who comes in who's a student at Stevens and he's co-signed by his parents for the rent, you have somebody who's moving out of New York and they're saving for a house. And a lot of the reasons people come to Hoboken, sometimes people with children stay in Hoboken now. Oftentimes they move to the suburbs. Those tenants turn over. Tenants who've been here since the 1980s, 1990s, some of these apartments are occupied for 30 and 40 years. So what happens with a 25% increase is the annual increases have maintained the apartment at a depressed rent. So if I moved in 1990 at $300 a month, my rent now is probably somewhere around $600, $800, $1,000, not more. When you can increase the rent on an apartment 25% on $1,000, you get $1,250. Meanwhile, you've got a tenant who's been in the apartment for 40 years. You have to replace the entire kitchen, all the bathrooms, do the floors, do the walls, often the windows, sometimes the electrical, sometimes the plumbing. It's always $25,000 and sometimes $100,000 to refit that apartment for the next tenant, or it's zero. If you can only get a $250 a month increase, can you justify spending $25,000 to fix up the apartment? No. So you know what you do? Nothing. You rent it to the next guy at the $1,250 because it's so far underneath the market. Somebody will rent it, even though it's not a particularly attractive apartment. And that's how things go. Now, that wouldn't be so bad if the person who was paying the $1,250 really needed a rent subsidy. But that's not what happens. What happens is there's a pack of applications for Hoboken apartments when they're vacated because everybody wants to live in Hoboken. It's cool. And especially if it's a $1,250 apartment, of course you get people applying for it. Who does the landlord pick out of that stack? Does he pick the person who can least afford to rent the apartment? Or does he pick the person who's most fit to rent the apartment? When he does that, you know what that tenant does? They come in and they spend tens of thousands of dollars to upgrade the unit because they want to live in a nice place and they can afford it. There's somebody who lived from New York City. There's somebody who came back to Hoboken from the suburbs. There's somebody who has money and wants to live in a nice place. And if they can get a $1,250 rent, they can invest in their own unit. Why isn't it that the landlord can invest in that unit? Why can't the landlord have access to capital in the form of a rationally increased rent? And that's where this conversation starts. The problem with rent control is the first year, the second year, the third year, it doesn't mean that much. The apartments are at market. They increase 3, 4, 5%. Maybe market increases a little bit faster, but there's not much of a gap between value and the rent you can collect. 40 years later, the gap is substantial. and it undermines the ability of a owner to have a business plan and rent control.
Now, so the decontrol stuff, as it currently stands, my understanding is that there are pass-throughs on value increases on your property, right? You can do work to the property and pass that through at a percentage, right? So probably not, you don't recoup the entire, let's call it $25,000, $100,000, the numbers that you use to do stuff. But what does a pass-through look like for a landlord who does work?
The work you can do to the interior of the apartment doesn't count to the pass-through. It's only the common work in the building. If you do interior work to the apartment and you go for a capital improvement surcharge on that investment, you have to go through a process at the rent control board that no one does. The only time you go through it is when you've done a gut renovation and you want to decontrol the building entirely, or you've had to do such a massive improvement in an infrastructure area that you're entitled to pass that through to the tenants.
But they could, if they did the work inside and they wanted to do a capital gains pass through, there is an option for them to do that
in a very restrictive way, and nobody does it.
But the fact that nobody does it is not, that's neither here nor there.
That's
a process currently. There is currently a process for them to do it, though.
If it got you a reasonable return, you do it. But it's so restrictive and so difficult to get approval from the Hoboken Rent Control Board on those improvements when they're inside the apartment that nobody does them. I understand your point. Well, we made it available. If you didn't take it, it's on you. No, I don't buy that, because if it were rewarding, people would do it. And because we know that it's not rewarding, we don't do it. And because we know that we have to go in front of a rent control board that's definitely set up as a kangaroo court for tenants, they deny everything they can deny. It doesn't make sense for that to be what landlords have to rely on as a policy to get a return on their investment. The policy should be a new tenant has come in. That tenant doesn't have a state. The previous tenant may have had a state. The previous tenant may have had a call to say, I'm tenured, I deserve protection. Okay, fine. The next tenant doesn't deserve to build on the previous tenant's tenure. The next tenant should be able to make their own bargain. And this is an important part, Tom, and you know this too. Tenants set the market, not landlords.
Sure.
It's demand and willingness to pay that sets the market. So the landlord doesn't have this ability to just run up rents irrationally. They get increased by demand. So if a landlord wants to prepare that unit for somebody who can afford it, and that person can afford it, why is the city interrupting that transaction?
Well, I think the city, the oversimplified answer here is because the city's protecting a certain class, right? They're protecting a class, and whether or not that class is getting access to that unit, their goal here is to protect a certain class, right? So all the people that you're talking about, landlords, everything else, right? How many do you have the numbers of how many individually owned condos fall under the rent control, right? Because we could talk about buildings and everything else, but the truth is that the corporations that are buying these buildings, when these buildings are changing hands, you and I both know that the price is set on the current operating costs, and these companies and these corporations are not just buying property based on whatever price that the seller may necessarily want. They're doing their own math, and they're coming up to a market value based on the current income of that property, right? So it's not like a building. We'll use the Harlow, for example, right? It's not like the Harlow, the people that develop the Harlow are hurting for money because of the rent control rules, right? And then on the other side of that thing, let's use a building like Marine View, right? If Marine View were to change hands, the price is going to be set based on what the current net operating expenses are. So in that case, the market is going to be the market. So I think that the target here really is the people who own the individual condos. So of the rent control numbers, do you know off the top of your head, or do you have those numbers of how many individually owned condos, buildings set aside, condo units in tenement buildings are actually fall under the rent control?
So a condominium unit, which is a unit that's individually owned as part of a communal structure, there's probably 8,000 of those in Hoboken. There's 7,500 rent controlled units, best we can tell. The Hoboken Housing Department does not have the capacity to actually give you a count, but the assessor does. So we look at probably 7,500 units. The housing department, rent control department is claiming now that there are about 2,000 registered units. That's wrong. There are many more registered units than 2,000, but they don't know how to use their own technology, and they can't get a good count together, and they really don't have the resources to regulate the market. So from an individual condominium unit, let's look at those folks. Those folks are not traditionally rent controlled the way the 7,500 that I'm talking about are. If they're building upon new construction, filed an exemption, they're exempt from rent control for 30 years. Most people who built condos didn't file exemptions because why would you? You're expecting the owner to occupy the unit. Well, sometimes those units become investment units. By the letter of the law, if they've been occupied for 2 years, they're decontrolled. They're not under rent control. By the noise that comes from the rent control office, in particular by the Vice Chairman Jenny Labens, who says that every condo unit's under rent control. And there's litigation out there right now about that. And it's expensive litigation, and it makes the city vulnerable, actually, to a finding against them if they've, through the way that they've regulated their rent control office, deprived a unit owner of value. They're on the hook for the damages. All right, let's put that aside. If I have lived in Hoboken for 25 years, my building's not exempt from rent control, I'm a condo owner, individual condo owner, and I want to move to Florida and rent my unit or keep my unit in my family. Should that be under rent control? And what should the rent set be? What if the condominium building was converted in 1986, which is the data point for all rent control data in Hoboken? The rent there, maybe I was paying $400 a month. Are you telling me that now my base rent is $400 a month? Because that's what the rent control office holds. We know that's ridiculous. The common charges in the building are $1,000 a month. So this is what we're talking about.
As a condo, your HOA is not going to, in those buildings you're talking about, it's going to be rare that the condos are going to be the condo HOA fees are going to be $1,000 a month. But I understand that there's going to be overhead that's going to be higher than what you're saying, right? And I think that's more your point. The $1,000 a month is probably an exaggeration.
Okay, so let's say it's $500, and I can get $350 a month in rent, or $550 a month in rent. We know that all that does is deprives that person of the right to their real estate. They either have to sell it or they have to occupy it. They can't rent it to somebody at that number. So that's why the $2,500 fee for a vacancy decontrol that comes from this referendum is important, not just to the multifamily owner, it's important to the condominium owner too, because again, being in the business, if you go to sell something and that something has a restriction on it, i.e. it can't be an investor unit, there are fewer buyers and less demand equals lower price. So those condo owners do get affected by the fact that they are being held under rent control. And again, there'll be a legal decision on that in the next year or two, but whatever. The policy is the point. Why are we allowing that policy to happen when we can fix it?
Do you think that the painting with a broad brush of just saying that, we'll just decontrol everything is truly the best approach to fixing this? Or do you think someplace between doing nothing and completely changing the way that the rent control landscape has looked in Hoboken forever is the answer, right? Because
so in 35 years of doing this, I've never said eliminate rent control from a community. I've never said it. I will never say it, because you know why? A deal's a deal. If you had people move in who were told you can live here and your rent will be controlled every year, you will not have excessive rent increases, you got to protect those people. There's no question about it. So no, I don't believe that there's such a thing as permanent decontrol. I think what happens is you allow somebody to move into the unit who makes their own bargain. They look at the apartment, they decide whether or not the landlord's offering price is correct. If they like it, they rent it. If they don't, they counter and they move on to someplace else. That's how markets work. So if that's the case, why is it that unit, which is affordable to me when I rent it, which falls under rent control right after I rent it, why is that bad policy? The unit was affordable to me when I moved in. Why did it have to be discounted beneath the market rent so that the landlord is deprived of his value of his property and can't even fix it up? Why is that good policy when the person who's moving in can afford to pay the rent for the apartment they want? It does not make sense. I'm not saying take out rent control. I'm not saying decontrol every unit. I'm saying when an apartment becomes vacant, if you allow it to be decontrolled, the market will function much better and reward all the players in the market, including the city, that better than what's happening now, which is crazy. Listen
So
to
how
this
did you come?
story. We have one of our members of the committee of petitioners, a woman named Rose Markle. She had to replace her fire escape. She's got an 8-unit building. It was $50,000 to replace the fire escape. You know how much of it she could pass along to the tenants? Zero.
Okay.
So Rose went in.
Okay. So we're both on the same page. This system is flawed, right? And the current pass-through system is flawed. The $2,500 that you're saying to effectively decontrol buildings and units and things like that. Where does that number come from? And how do you see that working? Right? Because because truthfully, what I see happening is when something decontrols, use a condo to start, right? They give $2,500. And I know that
most of these won't be condos. They'll mostly be units in multifamily buildings, not condominium units. There's an important distinction between those two things.
Okay, that's fair. That's fair, right? So let's call it a four unit, a tenement building, right? 4, 6 units, whatever it is, right?
Yep.
They go $2,500 per unit as they become vacant.
Yep.
Right. To now set the market rent at the current market and effectively agree or disagree with the way that things get done and the current application systems and things like that, but effectively take an extremely affordable housing unit off of the market completely. Right. Where does the $2,500 come from?
So, all right, there's two questions here. I'll answer the first. The $2,500 comes from looking at what fees are in Hoboken right now and trying to figure out a place where landlords are likely to pay the fee, because you want them to pay the fee because that goes to creating affordable housing. So we came up with $2,500. Is it the right number? When I negotiated a compromise ordinance with the city that, by the way, passed 8-0 on first reading and then got defeated 9-0 on second reading for political reasons. But the council,
but Ron, a lot of things get passed on first reading so they can get to a second reading and you can have a public discussion and things like that, right? So however, let's not say that it's unfair to say that only for political reasons it failed on the second one, right?
Things get
passed all the time.
I grant you that, but they came to us with their proposal. So when they come to us with our proposal and they tell me negotiate in good faith and we will pass this, and then 40 people from Jersey City show up at the public meeting and they vote it down, I've got a right to say, I feel like I kind of got sandbagged. And the reason I got sandbagged and the reason I bring it up now is to say, when they came to us with their compromise ordinance, they set the decontrol at $4,000. So is $2,500 right? Is $4,000 right? Tom, I'm not sure. All I know is the city doesn't do 5 things. It doesn't use its access to 𝗪𝗏 tax credit grants from the state to build affordable housing. When in Newark, in a job that I worked on, the developer got $250,000 per unit in tax credit grants. If you use your own property in Hoboken, you can actually build a unit for that. They don't even need our $2,500. Then you look at the state encouragements. You look at the federal encouragements. You look at the loan discounts they can get from CRA lenders. There's all kinds of things Hoboken can do to provide additional affordable housing and workforce housing, housing for bartenders and teachers and people who can't necessarily pay a market rent in Hoboken. They could do that. They don't. Why? And to say to us, you're not giving us enough money to create real affordable housing and the landlord's getting a windfall, okay, then why did you come back at $4,000? Okay. When this referendum expires 3 years from now, go ahead and reset it at $4,000. But the point being that our money, our $10 to $15 million, when I say the apartment industry is $10 to $15 million, which will come in over the next 7 years from these provisions, can be ratcheted up to build 400 to 700 units of housing.
Where are they going to build those, though? Honest question. Where?
Housing Authority.
What's
the Housing Authority has. So the Housing Authority in Hoboken has mostly 4-story buildings. Take down the 4-story building and build a 30-story building. They got plenty of room.
And displace the people that are currently living in the 4-story buildings.
The people they'll do it a little bit at a time. They'll take some people from one part of it. They'll move them into another part. It won't be disruptive. And if you've seen the conditions in the housing authority,
I'm in them regularly. I'm in the housing authority regularly.
So you know what
my
that's
other
like.
career. Yep.
Build them a new building.
Okay. All right. So who controls that? Who controls that fund? You're saying that becomes a city allocated fund.
Well,
and
the city
the oversight is.
Yeah, the city has an affordable housing trust fund. You know what they spent last year on the affordable housing trust fund on housing? $2,100. They haven't built a unit in 61 years. So this money is going to go into that fund. This is their responsibility. They should be building the affordable housing. We're finally taking the rent control housing stock. This is an important point. We're making it so the rent control housing stock actually generates affordable housing units for people who need the discount, who need the subsidy. Right now, the rent control cohort does not create units for people who need affordable housing. It creates discounts for people who have plenty of income to pay a market rent.
So in terms of, all right, so here's my question for you, right? And let's kind of get into, I'm going to start to throw up questions here, right? I think Ron has made, enough of his stance, known, and we're coming up on 26 minutes now. So if you guys want to start to throw pointed questions in the chat, I'm happy to take those. And for those of you who are joining us, we've got Ron Simoncini, and he is the person kind of leading the charge on the ballot question for November 5th regarding rent control and the significant changes that are on the ballot on that and in that question. My question here is what do you say to the families that want to stay here? Right. And they're in, let's just say, a building such as Marine View, such as Church Towers, things like that, who have been born and raised here, who have been here forever, that they now inside of those buildings are trading up inside of those buildings. Right. And now all of a sudden, with the way that this decontrol goes, right, and the way that this goes, those buildings can easily just hand over the $2,500. And now they are effectively priced out of any real trade up. Right.
Well,
are you telling them because the way that you said this before is well, those people can go elsewhere and leave town?
No. So if you have permanent protection as a tenant, New Jersey
for the unit that you are currently living in.
So are we supposed to anticipate everybody else's family needs as you go forward and make sure that we reserve? Once one kid said in one of the dialogues about this, my girlfriend and I might get married someday. We might want to have a baby, and we're going to need a larger unit. And we want a unit with a discount available to us later because we have a unit with a discount now, but our family size might change. Dude, give me a break. You know what you do in this country? You work hard. You find a way to live under your budget. That's their housing budget. You want to make your family decisions? Don't make those decisions on the backs of the person who owns the property. Make that decision on your own responsibility. You want to have a family? Great, have it. You want to stay in that unit for the rest of your life? Stay in the unit for the rest of your life. But don't expect us as an industry to find a way, which we can't practically do it anyway, to make sure that there's a unit available to you on the housing size that you need when you need it. You know what that is? That's really selfish. That's incredibly self-centered.
So I think... Listen, and the truth is, right, I see both sides of this, right, from my real estate side of this and coaching in my investors and things like that. But I also, there's a side of me that says there needs to be an ability to stay in town, right, and some form of ability to stay in town. I understand your thought process of the answer is simple: work harder, right? But the truth is, with the way things work in this world, we all know that that's not necessarily realistic either, right? So
not everybody makes it. I've been very fortunate. I have more latitude than other people have, but I don't have latitude to do whatever I want. I can't go to Martha's Vineyard and buy a house. It's just not affordable to me.
Yeah, you weren't raised in Martha's Vineyard, though, were you?
I want people,
right? Because the people that are in these buildings, right, are people that largely made this community what it is,
and they
right?
should and
you would effectively be pushing people out when they go to change apartments.
That way. Nobody's being pushed out. If you want to, I'm saying to you, we're trying to provide the resources for the construction of new units for workforce housing and for people who need subsidies. We're handing that to the city. In the case of the people that you're talking about, there should be an application process. There should be an ability for them, if they need the income subsidy, if they need the rent subsidy, there should be an ability for them to move to the city. We're in agreement. I'm just saying the way to do it is not to constrict the market. The way to do it is to actually take the money that's available to Hoboken, build those units, and let those folks move. I'm not disagreeing with you about that. I'm only saying, you're giving examples of people who, once they want to vacate or change their lifestyle, shouldn't there be something equally affordable in the size unit that they need? Do you really think practically that there's ever going to be a system that accommodates that?
No, I get that. I get what you're saying there. But the truth is, it exists. Practically, there is a system right now that exists. Am I wrong in saying that? The way that it's currently written, things like that is there is a system currently.
If they could get the unit, I would agree with you. But they can't get the unit. The people who want to move up we're faced with the market forces that we're all faced with. When they want to vacate and get a bigger or smaller unit, they have to go shopping for it. Sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's in West New York, sometimes it's in Jersey City, sometimes it's in Lower Manhattan, and sometimes it's in Hoboken. But the whims of the marketplace that's never going to be achievable. You're never going to be able to govern it that way. Build them more units.
Okay. So let me get through here. We covered how did we get to the 2,500? Guys, if you guys have actual questions, pointed questions, this is the point where I'll throw them up on the screen. Drop them in if you guys have actual questions for Ron. Again, the idea here, guys, is not to, get confrontational, right? It's simply to educate on their stance. So if you guys have something for Ron, feel free to throw it up. We'll give this thing another couple of minutes here. Ron, what else should people know when it comes to this vote? Right. So instead of going back and forth, let's talk a little bit about what the real changes are going to be.
And by the way, I really appreciate this discussion because you're bringing out the policy points that need to be discussed. And even if you and I have differences, they seem minor, but our differences are important for people to see because that they get to pick now. So, the one thing that people
here's a good one before we jump in, right? Because I don't want to lose it in the chat, right? Tony, I'm going to throw this up here. Tony asked the question: how many rent control units has Hoboken lost over the last 25 years? Do you have that number? Is that readily available?
So when I started advocating for property owners in Hoboken in 2002, I met a guy named 𝗪𝗪𝗃𝗪𝗃𝗪𝗃, who used to be the executive director.
I know Joe. I knew Joe. Yeah, his father.
I know his son. Years ago.
Yep.
At that point, we had 12,500 units in Hoboken. We now have 7,500. So you've lost 40%.
Where do they go? When we say that we lose 40%, where do they go? Right? Because do they sell off to an owner occupant?
Yep.
Right.
They convert the condominium, or the 4-unit building on Park or Garden becomes a 1-unit brownstone for one family.
So and we talk about the whole the market bearing what it'll bear, right? That's also part of the market. Right, that's part of the natural landscape of the way that this market.
Well, but here's the tension point: if I can only make $1,000 a month off of owning a 4-unit building, or I can cash out for $1 million, I cash out for the $1 million. If I can make $5,000 a month, I might maintain my rental. So what you're basically doing to these owners is you're giving them no choice. It's like I can cash out, I can wait for these units to vacate. I can then convert to condominium and sell to one family. Or if I've got a decent enough size building and the units are nice enough, I can convert them all to condominium. And then I'll sell them myself one at a time. That's a far more virtuous position for the property owner than renting at discounts. So you lost 5,000 units to that. And you're going to lose, by the way, if we don't succeed here, you'll lose 2,000 right away. I predict that in the next 2 years, you will lose 2,000 units if this doesn't pass.
And how did you get this? And how do you come to that prediction?
Because I look at the number of units in the smaller buildings and the larger buildings, and I just take out all the buildings that can't practically convert, that from a mechanical point of view, pragmatic point of view, there's just no way for them to convert. And I look at the number of units that are said to be far under market. They're mostly in smaller buildings. And the tension on those property owners is, am I going to really keep giving the value of this building to these tenants in here? Or am I going to convert it to condominium and let somebody have either a nice single family home or nice units that they can fix up themselves so that I'll fix up for them and those will be in the market in different forms of ownership. I really think that we're trying to save rent control here, honestly. And I know that everybody's going to laugh at me and hoot at me over that. But I've looked at this policy for 22 years.
Because this isn't just for the record. This is not your first time that you've had this battle or headed up this battle in Hoboken. Is that correct?
Yes, there have been. We won a referendum in 2011. We lost one in 2012. And in 2013, we did a redo on the 2012 referendum. We lost it again by less than 200 votes the second time and by less than 60 votes the first time. So this has been it's been close calls. The referendum we won.
What was the most recent changes that were happened to rent control, right? Because this has been a significant. There's been a lot of changes. And guys, just so you guys know too, I see your stuff in the chat, and I'm trying to still listen to Ron and also read through. So if I'm missing stuff, I do apologize. I do have something queued up here that I wanted to throw up, so I'm going to throw it up. I'm going to let Ron talk about this quickly, and then I'll continue to scroll. But what was the most recent changes? And I want this question up from Gordon quickly, but I want to talk about the most recent changes, and I just didn't want to lose this question from Gordon. What were the most recent changes?
So first, the most recent changes. This whole thing was triggered in 2022 when certain council members attempted to further constrain the marketplace. And that resulted in a lot of back and forth. Last year in 2000,
how did they attempt to further constrain the market?
Because it used to be that the annual rent increases were CPI, and they changed it to put a limit on it. So when there was high inflation, they deprived the owner of the right to pass along the increased expenses that resulted from that inflation. Inflation was at 9%. They rolled it back. They wanted to roll it back to 3%. They finally rolled it back to 5%. And then they tried to change the vacancy decontrol rules to make it once every 5 years and only 10% of the rent. And we fought that back entirely. The next year they came back with really what triggered the referendum, which is that in the past in Hoboken, you have this provision called rent registration. And that's where the owner provides the city with his rents. And if he's increased them, he reports what his increases were that year. The city for decades had allowed the owners to register rents they weren't charging. So if my uncle was in a unit upstairs from me and he rented at $800 a month, I had the right to increase him, but I didn't. I just kept him at the $800 a month and I banked the increase, right? So those can be substantial over time. And the rent control board and the rent control office had held for decades that I had the right as the property owner for the next tenant to charge what the actual legal rent would have been rather than the rent that I was charging my uncle. Last year, they undid that. And what was really, really raw about it was that a lot of property owners during COVID had to reduce their rents to attract renters. And the city refused to let them recover the rents to the levels they were before COVID. And that pissed everybody off. And that's why our group came together and said, you know what? Enough is enough. And we're taking the vote into our own hands because we couldn't get a fair shake from the elected officials.
Okay. All right. So let's go, Ron. There's 25. This question from Gordon Chu. Ron, does a $2,500 fee upon a rent increase post vacancy apply to any increase or to any rental increase above a certain percentage?
So the $2,500 is an option that the property owner has to decontrol the unit. Many property owners will elect to simply take the 25% vacancy decontrol that's afforded to them every 3 years. And some will choose to pay the $2,500 and get a vacancy decontrol that presumably will be greater than 25%.
Okay. So by decontrolling it at that $2,500, and here's my thing, right? Is that decontrol contribution, let's call it, right, to the bucket, is right. So
passing the hat, Tom. We're passing the hat.
Throw it into the bucket, right, for the landlords, right? Make sure the landlords are taken care of here, right? So that decontrol there. Where was I going with this? That I lost my train of lost the train of thought there that I was going with the
You'll get it back
with that decontrol. So let's see what else we've got here in the chat, guys. Questions. Ron, How many? Okay, pay. Okay, here's a good one, right? Because as we're looking at this, the target here, right, is my opinion, the people who are punished on this, right, are the smaller units, right, the smaller building units, the 4-unit owners, right, who maybe own the building for 100 years, right? It's been in the family, whatever it may be. The condo units of somebody that moved out and now things are significantly different, or they bought it as an investment, didn't understand the landscape. And frankly, if you didn't understand the landscape, I got to be honest with you, if you didn't understand the landscape when you bought it as an investment unit,
that's on you.
Shameless plug here,
Totally
as a real estate advisor who educates my clients, you should have hired somebody better to explain to you the way that this town works, right? So,
no sympathy for people who are too stupid to read the contract.
Stupid is strong language here, Ron. We're talking strong language, right? I think it's more sympathy, no sympathy for people who fail to do their own research and their own due diligence in the way that things work, right? Let's not get too aggressive. So, how many units do you estimate will pay under $1,000, or say $475, $675? Right? This is a good question.
That's a really
let's
hard
face
question.
But just so everybody kind of understands here the landscape, right? And I ran some numbers the last couple months on averages, right? So the last 3 months for a 1-bedroom average over the last 3 months has been upwards of around $3,000 a month rent, right? 2 bedrooms around just over 4,000, and 3 bedrooms are $5,400 a month in rent over average over the last 3 months. And you go back a year, right? You're at $2,998 for a 1-bedroom, $4,087 for a 2-bedroom, and $5,400. So they've been pretty steadily at those averages, right? So if we're truly concerned about this,
were you able to filter out for rent control units, or are those?
I was not. I took it from all this data is from the MLS, right? So anything that's not on the MLS unfortunately isn't rolled into this, right? And we all know there's a ton of units that were not rolled through the MLS. I took the stats and the numbers that were available to me to run this, right? But when we talk about this, you're making it out as though there's an abundance of units that are paying so much below market rate and everything else. How many units on average, or do you have an idea of what those numbers look like to per Tony's question?
So here's my guess. My guess is that 50% of the rent controlled units are at or close to market, and that there's a percentile, probably a decile. So as I go 10% of the units, so now I'm at 60% of the units, I'm at 75% of the rent. 10% down more than that, I'm at 50% of the market rent. Okay. 10% down more from that, I'm at 25% of the market rent. Below that, I don't think that there's very many units. 𝗪𝗏𝗪𝗏𝗃, the tenant advocate, estimated that as 10% of the market the other night. I'll take Cheryl's number. I'll say 750 units are $750 or less. I'll accept the tenant's conditions there. So if the interesting thing about this argument is, if there's not too many units under market, then why are we worried about this provision? And if there are tons of units under market, shouldn't we really be worried about this provision? So either way, my rent control referendum is legit. So I believe that if you look at the actual sort of dynamic here, that's why I'm saying I think it's 4,000 units out of the 7,500 over 7 years. I think you have a lot of very, very long tenured tenants right now.
I think so too. I think that's a fair assessment.
And they're going to age out. It just is what it is. When they age out, what should happen to the unit? Should it stay at $750 a month rent, or the 25% increase on $750 brings it to $925? Is that right? It's just not right.
So there's and these aging out of those affordable units, right? That's why I think that there's like 3 sides to every story, right? There's their side, your side, and then someplace in the middle is actually the truth, right? And I think that this whole situation right now, I think that this is a perfect example of the 3 sides to every story, right? And in my opinion, I think that I feel for the owners who have these long-term tenants, because things have changed so significantly over time, right? But to be able to go from that to market rent or whatever that may be, right? It's easier for me to feel bad for the landlords that have owned the property for all those years, right? It's harder for me to feel bad for the landlords who bought into that property knowing full well what that was, right? And now these people, and now these people are looking at it going, oh, now I have a chance to really cash in because I got this. I acquired this tenement building at such a depreciated cost because of the tenants that were in place. And now I'll have the opportunity to turn around and really cash in on my investment.
No, I agree with you. We're in agreement. But in
Right.
this country, there's something called equal protection. So the law has to work the same way for everyone. Not only can't we get inside everybody's pocket to figure out what they deserve and don't deserve, if that's even our right, we can't get inside their head to figure out what they were thinking when they bought it or what they're thinking right now. All we can say is what's the most rewarding policy for this municipality. It can't be what's happening now. Can't.
But you're saying, so you're saying, and now you just brought something up, right? Is your approach to what's best for the municipality, or is your approach what's best for the landlords right now?
Well, I think it's best for the municipality, and I'll say why. Right now, those units don't pay their fair share of property taxes because, as you know, New Jersey's an income state. Property taxes are computed on commercial property based on their revenue. So when you depress the revenue, you depress the property tax collection. Guess who gets that? The condo owner. The condo owner is the last resort for the city budget. When the commercial properties don't pay what they need to pay because of the status that they have as income generating, the condo owner and the single family homeowner get that property tax bill. Is it fair for the condo owner to pay extra property taxes so some kid can move from New York to Hoboken and pay a rent of 50% of the market when that kid's making $200,000 a year? You look at the incomes of some of the advocates, and I'm not going to go into it here. You look up the people who are advocating for the no vote, look up their job and what they make. They don't need a subsidy.
Okay, but are they not within their rights to fight for people who do?
Help themselves. That's what the country's all about. We all have to debate these issues and figure out where we come out at it. But I don't think that we need to be sorry when we're saying this policy where you're getting an apartment really cheap when you don't need a subsidy and it deprives the city of property taxes it otherwise would have collected, and you didn't need the subsidy. What have we really done? Haven't we benefited the city to a far greater degree by having a workable policy than this Pollyanna virtue messaging that says, I did something for affordable housing because I made sure that rent-controlled property owners can't make money? That's not a legitimate policy position.
So we've got something, and I wanted to throw this up here because it was something about a quote that you had in the news. So let's kind of run through this together. I didn't want to lose it. So he said here, he is not against rent control, and your propaganda claims you're defending it. Not sure if they're talking to me or that my propaganda claims, but
no, it's me.
Okay.
I know who this is, and I know what to say.
Has he changed his position versus his quote in the news?
Look, I've never been quoted in the news as saying I think that rent control should be abolished. I'm right now saying that when rent control is in place in a community, you have to keep it. It's impractical to take any other position. So I haven't changed my position at all. I think this rent control ordinance is the worst I've ever seen. It's the worst.
Dude. That's a big statement. The worst that you've ever seen is a big statement. For a guy who's been in this world, you say 25 years, right? I mean,
I've seen them all. I can't figure out another rent control ordinance that's this highly restrictive that doesn't provide at least some escape. What other rent control ordinance in New Jersey? There are 3 or 4 that restrict 1 to 4 family units. Why are you restricting a small property owner or an owner of a small building under the rent control ordinance? He's got all this regulatory expense on that. And he's completely encouraged to sell the property when he gets a market value for it. So I don't see why we would be restricting 1 to 4 unit buildings when all they do is get converted to condominium or single family home anyway, and you lose all that volume in the market. So yes, this is the worst rent control ordinance. And I believe that this council, which continues to say, Tiffany Fisher said in a debate with me the other night, well, if we pass this rent control ordinance, we don't get to talk about it for 3 years, and we could still talk about changes to the rent control ordinance. Tiffany, we've been talking about the changes for 2.5 years. You guys changed it twice, and because you were afraid of a mayoral veto, you reversed your position on the change. And now you're trying to say vote no so we can keep talking? What do you want to talk about?
Okay. Well, I think that's, I hope that we answered some questions here, guys. If you have some last minute stuff, please throw it up in the chat. I'm going to kind of look through here briefly, quickly, and see if there's anything that I missed in terms of questions that were
The
sent
last thing I will
in.
say is,
Yes,
there's
please
a
go.
claim that property owners will harass tenants out of their units.
Okay,
If
good.
they
That
haven't-
was topic. That was topic that I
Okay.
had. Yes.
Right. All right, let's look at that. The city has not said once, tenants, don't worry about that. We're going to protect you. It's the city's duty to protect tenants from harassment. New Jersey's landlord-tenant laws are the most stringent in the country, and the penalties from harassment in New Jersey are jail time. You really think some guy is going to go to jail to raise his rent on a tenant an extra $400 a month? It's not going to happen.
But
You
yeah,
haven't seen it.
on the flip side of that, Ron, think about the history of this city in particular when it comes to tenant rules and things like that, and so there is a fairly large fear of that kind of stuff, just
The
because
last time
the
that
long history in
happened,
this town.
I was running track for Ballard High School in Louisville, Kentucky, and you weren't even born.
That's very true. I was not born.
So you're
No,
looking at a
definitely.
situation where there's currently a tenant advocate. There's 5 people working in the housing department. Hoboken has 200 cops. You really think it's escaped people's notice that landlords have a program of harassment to create vacancies? It's just not happening. And the city's duty is to protect it. So when the city stays silent, when tenants say vote no because we're going to get harassed out of our units, and the city doesn't say, wait a minute, let's be clear here, we'll protect you. Is the city saying that it can't protect them? Is it saying it won't protect them? Is it saying it's politically advantageous to not speak about that, when the fact of the matter is they have the resources to protect these tenants and there haven't been legitimate claims in decades?
I think again, I think that's someplace between there. I think that there probably is a fair amount of harassment that goes on. I think that there's, and it can come in different ways. I think that there are some people that probably have their very own, very true stories of things that landlords did to them. Proving that is a different thing, right? So talk a little bit about this. How does this affect 3-unit buildings? And then my goal here, when we wrap it up, I mean, I love this conversation. I love the back and forth here. I hope that we gave some clarity to some people. It seems like it probably helped a little bit. But Ron, how does this affect 3-unit buildings?
So IndyCom is 𝗪𝗏𝗪, and I'm not outing her. Everybody knows that's her handle. And she's the leader of the Hoboken Fair Housing Association, which has been around.
That's okay. And that's okay. And you're welcome to log on tomorrow as well when I interview the other side.
Listen, I like the fact that Cheryl's here. I like Cheryl. Cheryl and I have had a lot of productive conversations over the years. Cheryl and I were the first 2 people, landlord side, tenant side, to agree on changes to the provisions of the rent control ordinance because we wanted to make peace. We did that a year and a half ago, and I found the negotiations with her to be very productive. I think she was very fair. I was very fair to her, and I wish that those provisions had been changed because we wouldn't be here today. She's asking about 3-unit buildings. Cheryl's a tenant. I believe in a 2-unit building. It might be 3. She's been there for over 35-ish years. She pays an incredibly low rent, which she brags about a lot. I'm not going to out her and tell you how much it is, but it's very low. And so her concern is that if her building becomes deregulated, that she'll get pushed out. I believe the tenant protections will keep Cheryl in her apartment for the next 30 years, if that's how long she wants to stay. And I think that decontrol of smaller buildings in Hoboken is tenant friendly because it maintains those buildings in the rent control stock instead of making them available for conversion. And when Cheryl moves out of her building, that building is coming down or being converted.
So let me throw this out there, right? Something I've given some thought to, and I think that I'm a proponent of behavior rewarded is behavior repeated, right? And I think that there should be some form of reward, and maybe this is some place to find some kind of common ground here. Happy to have this discussion more off camera and with Cheryl and everybody else. I think that is there anything currently in place that if a owner lives in a unit of a 3-unit, 4-unit building, right? An owner occupies the unit, is there a road to decontrol the entire building while they're owner occupied, or some sort of incentive to have people invest and start to build their wealth here. And if they want to move on after 3-5 years, whatever it is, right? But they buy a 4-unit building, keep it as a 4-unit building instead of renovating it into a 1-family, live in it, and continue to have housing available.
There are provisions for owner occupancy does create provisions for the owner. It doesn't deprive the existing tenant of their right to inhabit until they vacate under their current situation, except in rare cases where the building's falling apart or, there's always exemptions to rules. But basically, if you want to occupy as an owner, there are some provisions that help you a little bit. But generally speaking, the tenant protections stay in place.
Yeah, because I got to be honest with you, it's hard for me to feel bad for the larger building owners who bought the buildings, looking at the finances, everything else. It's a little bit easier to have some sympathy for the mom and pop who own or the guy who owns maybe 2 or 3 properties that are 4-unit tenement buildings, things like that. So the larger scale buildings, you bought the building, you acquired that asset, very well knowing everything that was on those books. The smaller scale buildings of somebody that's trying to build their generational wealth, would hope that they'd have some road to continue to build that wealth.
I do agree with you, Tom, but I just want to point out that those people, even in the larger buildings, when they did their underwriting before COVID, they expected to be able to always charge the rent that was being charged at that time. When COVID happened and the rents reduced, at that moment, they were entitled to recover the rents to their pre-COVID rent. The council changed that. So while you're right to not shed any tears over what we're calling corporate investors, by the way, there's none of them we don't have one public company who's in support of MSTA. Most of their bylaws prevent them from doing so. But while I'm agreeing with you that if you've done your underwriting and you're in rent control, okay, fine. But during that underwriting, you could never have conceived that there would be COVID, your rents would be substantially reduced, and the council would then undertake it to themselves to pass an ordinance, not for the existing tenant, but on a vacant unit that prevented you from recovering the rent you got before COVID. That was nasty. That was unnecessary, and it was nasty. And so while I agree with you, I'm not shedding any alligator tears. However, that person could never have anticipated that, and they got screwed. And they're mad enough to contribute to our campaign and try to make it right again.
Okay. So with that, guys, I'm going to wrap up. I mean, we've been on this. This is a great conversation. My target time here was 30 to 40 minutes. We're at the 57-minute mark. So this is honestly, I love it. It was great. I appreciate everybody tuning in. I will have this sent out to anybody who registered for this. I will send over the actual recording. Ron, if you guys have any documents and things like that, and I'm going to offer it to the United Tenant side as well, that you'd like attached to that in terms of like explaining your stuff, explaining your side, and
we'll just give you a link
some fact sheet, right?
Yeah,
a link to the website.
Go to the website if they want.
Yep. And I will have that out hopefully today or first thing tomorrow morning. Tomorrow we have the Hoboken United Tenants, which is the other side of this argument. I hope that you guys will tune in again. I hope that this was successful. Please make sure to reach out if you have any questions, and like and subscribe to the YouTube page and follow along. Hopefully we can do more stuff like this. I hope that this isn't the last time that I have some form of panel like this. I think that this is a good platform to try and educate as many people as possible.
Tom, I really appreciate being here. It's the best discussion I've had on this topic through the whole time.
Awesome.
And I credit you for that. And we look forward to hearing from the tenants tomorrow.
Great. Thanks, Ron. I appreciate it, guys. Thank you all so much.